from the All Indiana Podcast Network.
It's time for real conversation about the real issues that affect our communities.
Poverty, education, equality, and more.
This is Real Talk.
Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison.
Welcome to Real Talk on the All Indiana Podcast Network. I'm Reverend Charles Harrison, and on this episode, we will be talking about the prosecutor's race here in Marion County between current prosecutor Ryan Mears and his challenger Cindy Carrasco with Rick Snyder, the president of F.O.P 86 here in Indianapolis. Hello, this is Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison, and thank you so much for joining me on my podcast show today. Well, in Marion County, in the next few days, 4 days from now, we're going to have an election, and the big election in the city is the prosecutor's race between current prosecutor Ryan Mears and his challenger, Cindy Carrasco. With me today on my podcast is Rick Snyder, who is the president of the Fraternal Order of Police 86 here in Indianapolis. I think I've seen on Twitter that he just got reelected to be president of the Fraternal Order of Police. And thank you so much, Rick, for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Listen, before we get into the prosecutor's race, let's talk a little bit about where we are in the violence. We have had we had 31 homicides in October out of 31 days. I think we've had 32 homicides in the last 34 days. This is the 34th day today. Talk a little bit about where you think we are. I think as of today, we're about at 827 people have been shot, 163 people stabbed, and we're at 198 in homicides. So obviously, we're going to surpass 200 plus homicides now for the third year in a row and the third time in the history of this city.
Well, that's right. And I think the context is important. I mean, you look at those numbers and what we see are the trends, which are 31 homicides in the month of October. What's doubly concerning about that is that's predictable. We've seen that we have exceeded 30 homicides in the month of October for the last 3 years now. And we know that those trends continue. But when you look at the numbers in full context, you see that we're getting ready to surpass 1,000 people shot or stabbed in our city. We're getting ready to break 200 homicides again for the third year in a row. And the death and the destruction keeps mounting. Now, what's interesting in that is we have never exceeded 200 homicides in the 200-plus year history of our city until the last 3 years. And so I think that any resident has to push pause and say, hey, what are the common denominators for this time when we are seeing such drastic impacts on people's lives? And it's not just the homicides. It's people who are being critically injured by being shot, stabbed, or other aggravated assaults. And so when we look at that, we have to say what coincides. Correlation doesn't mean causation, but it's definitely something worth looking at. And it's quite possible that there is a causal factor involved. And what happens to coincide with the last 3 years is that so-called bail reforms and other criminal justice reforms, which have done nothing but deform our communities and our ways of life, took effect in January of 2020. And now here we sit really reaping what has been sown. And I think residents are tired of it. I think they are fed up, and they are looking to make changes in structural leadership within the city of Indianapolis. And step one in that process is the elected prosecutor for Marion County.
You know, Rick, most people are really, I would say, unaware about the whole issue of bail reform or, criminal justice reform. And I don't think they have put, how that reform or what's being done has contributed to what we see in the rise in violence in the city. Can you talk a little bit about that in more detail to help residents see the correlation between the bail reform low bail or no bail, particularly with repeat violent offenders, and its impact on the level of violence that we're seeing now in the city?
Well, sure. I mean, what we're seeing you've got politicians who are paying political platitudes to evildoers in our community, where there's no accountability for crimes of violence, and that does nothing but serve to embolden violent offenders. They have no sense of not just accountability, but any fear of consequences. Sorry for all the background noise there. I'm on the road.
Okay, no problem.
And then with that, you have folks who are doing the crime and serving no time. And so all that does is embolden the violent offenders. We see the levels of violence surging. That's why we have seen that over the last 2 years. And Rev, we saw that in 2019.
That's true.
2019, in the fall of 2019, before all of these so-called reforms fully took effect, we saw over the horizon, we're able to see what was coming our way. And in doing that, we issued a call to action to this city, warning of what was coming and what else we needed to do to slow it down and adjust course. And first and foremost in that was the drastic reduction in bond amounts, bail amounts for crimes of violence. And remember, the key factor that we have always talked about is we are speaking about repeat violent offenders, not
right.
first-time, low-level, non-violent offenders, but repeat violent offenders. And what we have said is this: I think any person can understand and quite frankly, I think would agree that if you have a documented, demonstrated history of crimes of violence, where you have criminal convictions, not just arrests, but actual due process and convictions, that if you're rearrested for a new allegation of violence, you should sit in the penalty box for a little while until the system can get its hands around what is going on and make sure they're not just unnecessarily cycling you right back into the neighborhoods where we see needless violence continue to surge because we have folks that come out and seek vengeance or revenge on those who actually had the fortitude to call the police, report the crime, and also provide witness testimony. And that's what we're seeing. And it's not just in Indianapolis. Everybody's quick to point out that we're seeing crime and violence surge in major cities across our country, as though that should be an excuse for what's occurring here. Nothing could be further from the truth. But what I would say is, look at the common factors involved. And what you see is where crime and violence is surging is the common factors of arrest and rearrest of criminal violent offenders, catch and release criminal justice, and this revolving door that keeps amplifying the number of deaths and the numbers of victims in our communities.
This is Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison, and my guest today is Rick Snyder, who is the president of the Fraternal Order of Police, 86. Rick, one of the things that I have observed in my 23 years of really working with 10 Point on the streets and really being involved in this whole issue of crime reduction, I don't recall a time where there has been this level of tension between the prosecutor and law enforcement. And maybe I'm wrong. I was not aware of it, but there seems to be this tension there. And I know that the F.O.P. 86 did not endorse Ryan Mears for prosecutor, but Cindy Carrasco for this November election. Can you talk a little about that and help those of us in Indianapolis kind of understand kind of the dynamics there and what's really going on?
Sure. I mean, the factor that is involved in all of this is what we warned of on a national stage outside of the White House in December of 2019, where we had a meeting with the President of the United States at the time, and we warned of what was coming through the intentional steps that were being taken in major cities across our country. And all roads lead back to our prosecutors and our DAs. where we see progressive, so-called progressive, I would call them regressive, prosecutors with soft on crime, short-sighted agendas and policies. And what I warned of outside the West Wing was this: we are entering a phase where we have prosecutors and DAs who are intentionally working to decriminalize the criminals at the same time to depolice the police. And it's a recipe for disaster. Well, what do I mean by that? Take a good look at this prosecutor in Marion County. He spends more time telling you what crimes he won't enforce versus the ones that he will. And that would be fine if he was the chief public defender for Marion County, but he's supposed to be the prosecutor, the one prosecuting the crimes. And at the same time, he's taking steps to delegitimize our law enforcement officers by undercutting them in their enforcement actions. What do I mean by that? I mean, when officers are out here faithfully making the arrests, intervening in criminal activity, and taking the bad folks to jail, he is intentionally taking steps to dismiss the criminal charges, not file them, or offering sweetheart plea deals that allow for little or no jail time for crimes of violence, and for that offender to be cycled back into our neighborhoods, either free to roam about or out on electronic monitoring. And people say, well, maybe that happens some. No, in Indianapolis. See, this is what happens when you compare it to across the country.
Right.
And people try to minimize what's happening here. They say, well, crime is high in every city. Well, that's true, but people in Indianapolis care about what's happening in Indianapolis. People in central Indiana care what's happening in our capital city of our state. And what they know is this, is that we have more offenders on electronic monitoring systems than any other city in the nation. Now, that's not comparative statistics. That's not based on percentages. That's based on simple raw numbers. On any given day in Indianapolis, we have at least 4,300 criminal offenders on electronic GPS monitoring. Now, there is no other city, no Los Angeles, no New York City, no Chicago, cities that are 5, 7, 10 times the size of population of that of Indianapolis don't have anywhere near 4,000 plus offenders on GPS monitoring. So what is going on here in our city? And why would a prosecutor, knowing all of that, take proactive steps to offer soft on crime sweetheart plea deals that allow for no jail time, and in lieu of that, place them on this GPS monitoring? I was told, and I think you were too, I was told in 2019 going into 2020 that the reason why we had to do electronic monitoring and GPS systems, and also, by the way, low bonds for repeat offenders, was so that we didn't disproportionately impact communities of color or the poor by holding them in jail while awaiting a trial. We were told that disproportionately impacted and affected the poor. Now, here's the issue in that. This is the question I asked. Fair enough. If that's the case, when we put offenders, those who are convicted or are pre-trial, awaiting trial, on GPS monitoring in lieu of jail time, who pays for the GPS monitoring? Well, lo and behold, what we came to find out is that the offenders are paying for that. So the same offenders that we say can't afford a $1,000 bail, we put on electronic monitoring systems and charge them $14 a day. Now, Rev, that equals $420 a month. And oftentimes these offenders are on GPS monitoring for multiple months. So they actually end up paying more than what they would have to pay for the bail to get out of jail. So that does not add up. In fact, what it adds up to is somebody's making a whole lot of money. And when we find out that that's actually going to a publicly traded company, a private company that's publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange, it starts raising a lot of eyebrows and leads to more questions than answers.
You know, Rick, most of the rank and file officers that I talk to when I'm on the street with 10 Point, and I ask them the question of, you know, what do they believe is the contributing factor to the dramatic rise in violence in Indianapolis? And they do point to the broken judicial system, particularly of catch and release. So I do hear that on the street from officers who are out there, making the arrest, risking their lives, to protect the residents of this city, and they all expressed pretty much that they believe that has played a major role in the rise in violence that we have seen, particularly over the last 3 years, but even 7 years, where Indianapolis has seen the highest level of violence in the history of the city.
Well, and Rob, here's what we found out. Local media outlets did the research and actually did analysis on the criminal histories of known suspects of violent crimes, and here's what they found: that 40% of those suspects were out on pretrial release for other crimes, or had received prior criminal convictions that, had they been held according to those original sentences, and that for those crimes, they could not or would not have been available to commit this latest act of violence. So
Wow.
what's that tell us? That tells us that these latest incidents, where we're seeing record levels, that as many as 40% of those are preventable, had the system simply followed the law and held criminal offenders accountable according to the law previously. So when we have prosecutors like this one, Ryan Mears, who is unabashed about saying that he is a progressive prosecutor who subscribes to the same philosophies as prosecutors like that of Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, of George Gascon in Los Angeles, as Alvin Bragg in Manhattan as a DA, as Kimberly Fox in Chicago. I mean, what we're seeing is he subscribes and stands shoulder to shoulder with these same woke, broke prosecutors that are decriminalizing the criminals, depolicing the police, and amplifying destruction in our communities. So that's not up for debate. That's not up for dispute. The facts are the facts. So what it really does is lead to the question, which is, why would he do that? And in fairness to Ryan Mears, I've publicly challenged him on other radio shows to a unedited, live, public debate, where I can ask him questions related to issues affecting the workplace of law enforcement officers, the safety of our community. I can ask him questions, and he's more than able to ask me questions or contest the facts as they're being presented. But strikingly, he refuses to do that. And in fact, Reverend, it's been well documented over the last really 2 years now. Anytime on behalf of our officers and their families, I have asked this prosecutor questions about decisions he has made, either by phone, in writing, or even going to press conferences and asking the questions myself, he has refused to answer, and furthermore, he's ran away. That's why I call him Running Ryan Mears, because he always runs away from the questions and refuses to give answers. The problem is people are dying, and that's why we will always stand the line, stand up for the residents that we swear to protect and serve, but also stand up for our officers who are also being affected by this. See, people say, well, the FOP, they can't relate. Our police, they don't relate to what folks are experiencing in the neighborhoods. Well, I challenge that. It's the police and the residents who are the only ones in the neighborhoods 24 hours a day.
Right.
It's our police officers who across this nation are being shot on average once every 25 hours in our country. We have officers that are laying down their lives. We have officers that are being critically injured, like Officer Tommy Mangan, who was shot in the throat in serving our city. And he was shot in the throat by a repeat violent offender who later we found out should not have been on the streets, but only was because he was in violation of parole. And this prosecutor, Ryan Mears, publicly acknowledged and admitted that he knew the offender was in violation of parole and failed to notify the court of that on 2 separate occasions. And as a result, that offender was released back onto our streets awaiting trial, and mere weeks later is now alleged to have shot Officer Tommy Mangan in the throat and nearly killed him. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to rise up every single time on behalf of our officers when we see our job's dangerous enough.
Right.
We don't need that being compounded by decisions being made by a person or and a so-called prosecutor like Ryan Mears.
Rick, I think most people would want to know, why wouldn't the prosecutor, when we have this level of violence, not want to sit down at the table with other leaders of the city, with law enforcement, to try to figure out what could be done to help lower the level of violence collectively as a community?
Well, I mean, that is a fair question. I mean, the only thing we can go on, because we can't get responses, is actions. And, I always say I prefer actions over words, but when we look at the actions of this prosecutor, what we see are disingenuous actions. And let me give you an example of that. I'm not just blowing smoke. Let me give you an example. We have a prosecutor who touts that he has high conviction rates.
Right.
But he's the same prosecutor, in his own words, that in 2021, last year, is publicly quoted to acknowledge that because there's such a backlog of criminal cases awaiting trial in Marion County, in part due to the COVID pandemic, that they are only able to try a minimal number of cases per week. And because of that, he would have inflated conviction numbers. He said that in 2021. He told the public, because of these artificial reasons, and by the way, giving sweetheart plea deals with little or no jail time, the offender says, yeah, I'll take that deal. Right. They play Let's Make a Deal, like the old television game show.
So
Let's make a deal.
So is that considered a conviction if you do a plea deal?
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay.
So the offender can get little or no jail time, especially for crimes such as crimes involving guns, which is what we hear about all the time. And the prosecutor still chalks that up as a conviction. And then this same prosecutor who told you last year that he was going to have inflated conviction numbers, now this year runs around touting those just in time for an election. So that tells me that somebody's putting politics over people. At the same time, people, our fellow neighbors, are dying. And Rev, a lot of politicians try to inject race into these issues of crime and violence. Right. And I'm the first to say it's 7 out of every 10 of our homicide victims in Indianapolis. At least 7 out of every 10 are my fellow black neighbors. And these same politicians aren't speaking up for those lives. They're not telling me that those lives matter. Right. So it leads to a lot more questions than answers again.
Rick, one of the questions I have, and some of the people who kind of question, those of us who raise this issue about the broken judicial system and the repeat violent, offenders being arrested and rearrested and end up being either the suspect or the victim of violent crimes. Is anybody in IMPD or any law enforcement agency keeping track of the number of people who are the suspect or the victim of violent crimes who are a repeat violent offender? Do we have that kind of data anywhere?
Not to the extent that we should have. And that's why back in 2019 and going into 2020, our organization was in conjunction with folks like you and Pastor James Jackson from Fervent Prayer on the east side, Pastor Chris Holland from the Father's House on the southeast side. We all stood together and we called for what was titled a Commission on Criminal Justice Outcomes. Right. And what we said is, let's take every crime of violence on the table and work backward off of it. And let's do it just on the criminal conviction histories of both the suspects when known and the victims. We always know who the victims are. Right. But also the suspects when we know who they are. Right. Analyze their criminal conviction histories, not to point fingers at them. I mean, it's not about victim shaming or condemning folks. What we're trying to do is say, were there any opportunities to intervene prior to that latest act of violence occurring? And if there were missteps, missed opportunities, then how do we fill those gaps and help save lives moving forward? What was interesting in that, Rev, was that we had politicians who, remember, they're elected to serve and represent the people with the consent of the people, consent of the governed. They told us no, and not only did they tell us no, but they actually had the audacity to convene a public vote on it. And along a party line vote, all Democrats voted no, we're not going to do that, and all Republicans voted yes, let's do that. Now, again, for me, it's not about politics. It's about people and it's about public safety, but I can only look back at the facts.
Right.
And when I saw a partisan, party line vote rejecting the opportunity to intervene and prevent crime and violence, that's when I took a step back and said, whoa, this is much bigger than any of us even thought possible.
This is Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison, and my guest, for those of you who are just joining, is Rick Snyder, president of the Fraternal Order of Police 86 here in Indianapolis. Rick, one of the questions, before I let you go, the FOP has endorsed Cindy Carrasco. Why did they endorse her? And if she was elected, what difference do you think she could make over the next 4 years in helping to reduce the level of crime and violence in the city?
Well, I appreciate you asking that, because so often we spend so much time talking about why Ryan Mears is such a disaster and shouldn't be the prosecutor, that a lot of people want to hear, well, why should Cindy Carrasco be the prosecutor? And we're not just supporting her because she spent hours with our members explaining to them and answering their questions on relevant concerns related to the criminal justice system and process. And in that, what she made clear is that, one, she does have a wealth of experience, not just as an attorney, but of leading a law enforcement agency for the state of Indiana as the Inspector General for the state of Indiana. That's a huge role and responsibility. And in doing that, she led the enforcement of laws for the state, and in conjunction and consultation back to the governor for the state as well. She displayed leadership, she has displayed integrity, but she also displayed solid decision-making capabilities. And here's what we have said, is we need somebody in this office who is going to lead on that front. She also has a demonstrated compassion and interest in our victims. You know, she has done something in this campaign that Ryan Mears never did. She actually sat down with victims of crime and said, what was your experience like, and how can we help in that? Not just through prevention, but after the fact as well. And it was stunning, the responses she was getting from victims of violent crime who were saying, I never heard from the prosecutor's office. I received very little of assistance through the process of criminal prosecutions. And I also have significant concerns about retribution and revenge upon my life as a result of little support or interaction from this prosecutor. Well, those are monumental responses. And what she is doing is she's folding all of that into her policy-making decisions as she looks at stepping into this role as the Marion County Prosecutor. So that's why we say it's not that we're just against Ryan Mears, and it's that cops are for Carrasco. We support her because we've come to realize that Cindy equals safety, and safety equals Cindy. That's why we tell people, set your politics aside, put your people above your party, and vote your safety. For God's sakes, do it for your own self-interest, if nothing else. Vote your safety in this election for Marion County Prosecutor. I've talked to many Democrats across the city who are lifelong, hardcore voting Democrats. They tell me I always vote straight ticket, but this year I am going to vote all Democrats and scratch for Cindy Carrasco as the prosecutor because they are fed up with the crime and violence that they're seeing. And so I just encourage people, scratch for Cindy. This is the election to do that. I think we're seeing it even with things as nominal as yard signs. I shared with you recently, and I've shared publicly, I've been astonished by the number of Cindy for Indy yard signs I've seen pop up all over Meridian Kessler neighborhoods, Butler and Tarkington neighborhoods, and very traditional Democrat homes. I've seen yards where there are campaign signs for other Democrats for other offices, and then a Cindy for Indy sign stuck in the middle of all of that.
Right.
That tells me that people see we've got to make a change. We've got to change course here, and Ryan Mears must go. And final thing I would say, Rev, if for no other reason, I always say this. there should be one thing we can say that sums up why Ryan Mears should not be the next prosecutor, and that is the word FedEx, because the FedEx tragedy was later shown to have been preventable, and we saw that this same prosecutor failed to apply the law. By the way, Rev, a gun control law called a red flag law on this suspect, where we could have intervened and prevented him from purchasing additional weapons. And instead, the prosecutor, it didn't slip through the cracks. The prosecutor publicly acknowledged once again he failed to take action and let that case sit. And as a result, that suspect was able to go and purchase 2 more long guns that were used in that heinous mass murder at the FedEx. And if for no other reason, that's why this man should be removed from that office of trust. And we should be putting someone like Cindy Carrasco in there to take our city back.
Rick, thank you so much for joining me today. And I know you're on your way to Chicago, so you have a safe trip. And I pray for your traveling mercies that go with you. And then thank you for all the work that you do in this city and your voice as an advocate for the safety of all the residents of Indianapolis. So thank you again for joining me, and we'll certainly talk again after the election.
Thank you, and God bless.
All right. I am Reverend Charles Harrison, and this has been Real Talk. Join me next time as I bring you more Real Talk about the real issues that affect our communities here in Indianapolis and across the country. Be sure to follow and subscribe to this podcast and share it on Facebook and Twitter. This is Reverend Harrison. Thank you so much again for joining me, and I pray that you have a blessed and you have an awesome day.
This is Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison.
Be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast.
And be sure to check out other great podcasts on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
Online now at allindianapodcast.com.